Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It is a joy to be here in a conference dedicated to HPV and the secret doctrine. I think there are, as we have seen, there are many inspiring aspects of the teachings. And sometimes because of the difficulty of this book tends to be dismissed, or we suppose that people will not be interested in this. But when we actually present the teachings, I think most people see and can appreciate how important this text is in many ways. And today we are going to see a little more about the teachings that are within the secret doctrine, in particular in connection to the nature of the universe. How the universe started and what is its intrinsic nature, because I think this answers to a problem we have in modern times. Science has discovered amazing things about the universe, has developed the ability to perceive, to measure the light that comes from billions of years ago, that started billions of years ago, has discovered how the universe is formed. It knows what happens at the level of the subatomic particles, with particles that last for nanoseconds. And yet, the universe that science proposes is a thoroughly uninspiring universe. It's a flat universe, dead, blind, random, mechanical. And this has permeated our culture, the human mind. In the past, people lived more perhaps with a religious idea that there was some kind of transcendence. Even though religions are many times interpreted in ways that are not the deepest way, at least there is a sense of transcendence, of something, a purpose in life. But as the intellectual nature of humanity awakens and develops, and as science becomes the new God, then we start looking at life in terms of mechanical things. So the plant grows and gives fruit, produces fruit, just because there are chemical reactions. It's a mechanical thing. It's not that the plant or the flower is giving out beauty, is sharing unselfishly the perfume that it produces. We see nature, life, our own lives in terms of just mechanisms. And although that is part of reality, Blavatsky challenged that is the whole of reality. Blavatsky would say this aspect of reality that science is describing is the shadow of reality. There is something in reality that is far more transcendental, but science cannot get a hold of it. And it is perfectly fine. The function of science is not to get to the essence of things. It's just to describe the appearances of things. But because science becomes so dominant, then we search in science for answers about the essence of things, something that intrinsically science cannot do, because science can only talk about that which is measurable. But what gives purpose to our life is immeasurable. It's beyond the ability to be measured. Now, there is something in between. There is what Blavatsky called the occult science. Blavatsky proposed that there is the possibility of developing a science that doesn't stop only at the level of physical appearances. It can go deeper. And if it cannot touch the essences of things, at least it can see the manifestation, more primary, more transcendental manifestations of the essence of things. And in the secret doctrine, part of what Blavatsky presented is this occult science. The word occult comes from the Latin and means hidden. That nature which is hidden to our senses, to our five senses. Well, we know there is a whole universe, even on the physical plane, that is hidden to our five senses. But there is also something, as science developed, the technology extends the range of our senses. Now with a telescope, we can see far more than our eyes can see. With a microscope, the same. And we can extend all our five senses through means of technology. But all technology is limited to the physical plane. Blavatsky postulates there are non-physical planes, states of consciousness, that technology cannot really reach. So in order to reach these kind of planes of consciousness, we need to develop other senses. There are non-physical senses which are not quite spiritual. These senses are the ones that bring what we can call, within parapsychology, they talk about this extrasensory perception. These are some kind of psychic senses that give us a wider view of life and the universe, but they are still within the realm of senses. And therefore, we still perceive things through these senses, although in a wider way, we are still separate from the things we perceive. And Blavatsky said there is even something deeper than that. That is not really a sense in the sense of the word that we use, a means through which we perceive reality. There is the possibility of becoming one with whatever we are perceiving. And we know by becoming that which we are trying to perceive. Not by using senses because I'm separate, there is a distance between me and what I'm trying to perceive. And by becoming one with something, then we can start perceiving things that are not apparent to senses, whether physical or non-physical. So a lot of what Blavatsky proposes in The Secret Doctrine comes from, as we are going to see, a kind of science that uses these non-physical senses, and even more, that uses this ability to become one with the object of perception. And when this is done, the account of the universe that comes from that research is completely different in many ways to the one that science proposes. Not necessarily different on the physical plane, but different at the level of discovering a purpose that is not evident when we are just looking at the material aspect of the universe. And the problem of the lack of purpose that we have in this culture is a deep problem. Now universities are, because for example, if there is no transcendental purpose, why am I alive? The natural conclusion that most people draw is that I am alive to have a good time, to have fun, to have pleasure. What else? And that life becomes very self-centered. How can I maximize my pleasure, my happiness here on earth? And that, of course, generates an individualistic culture that doesn't care if in pursuing the pleasure we are destroying the planet, we are destroying other countries, we are destroying our families. That is just a collateral, problem. The purpose of life, if life is anything, is for me to be happy. And that's, I think, permeating our culture to a large extent. Now, universities are now discovering that there is a difference between what they call happiness and the sense of purpose. They see that even people who say they are happy because they have what they want, they have a very nice house, they have a family, a car, they have money, they can go on vacations, still, they don't necessarily feel that their lives have a purpose. So now in universities, they are seeing there is a difference between a so-called happy life and a purposeful life. And I think that is a very important discovery. And perhaps we can start looking more into what makes life worth living? What makes life purposeful? And I think the secret doctrine shows a metaphysical foundation for this idea of purpose. So let us see, I'm going to go through, do a little comparison between how the secret doctrine explains the universe and how science does, especially the latest theories that are so radical and so new that are not being accepted by most scientists, but there are very important scientists, as I'm going to show you, that are proposing these theories. And interestingly enough, these theories match what Blavatsky was saying over 130 or 130 years ago. So let us first look at this idea of the occult science in the words of Blavatsky. She says the system in question, the system that she presents in the secret doctrine, is no fancy of one or several isolated individuals. It is the uninterrupted record covering thousands of generations of seers whose respective experiences were made to test and to verify the traditions passed orally by one early race to another. So she's postulating here that since the very beginning of humanity, there is a certain wisdom that was given to the early humanity. This is a whole concept in itself. I cannot go into it in detail, but as Maria pointed out yesterday, humanity is from the very beginning taken care of by something in the universe that is a certain order in the universe that we cannot perceive by means of the scientific research, but there is in the universe this motherly aspect in which a new humanity is not left to its own devices to blindly search by trial and error whether this berry can be eaten or this one cannot be eaten, to discover just by accident or by groping in the darkness how to develop agriculture and all of this, mathematics, astronomy. There is a system in the universe where, let's say, beings who were human beings, who have evolved in the past, they come to whenever a new evolution begins, and they guide the early humanity. And this is recorded in most ancient traditions as the golden age of humanity, when the gods walked among us. And I cannot go in justifying this. If we take it out of context, it may seem like something fantastical. But if we look the whole picture that Blavatsky is producing, it makes sense from that point of view. But we cannot go into that. Basically, what concerns us is that there is a wisdom that is given to humanity. And then, as humanity evolves, there are these people who begin to be able to verify this wisdom. These generations of seers that Blavatsky talks about, they test and verify the traditions that were received in the early humanity. And how do they do this? Blavatsky says it is answered by checking, testing, and verifying in every department of nature the traditions of old, by the independent visions of great adepts, that is, men and women too. Blavatsky uses the word men in a general sense, as it was used in the 19th century, but she talks about women adepts also, who have developed and perfected their physical, mental, psychic, and spiritual organizations to the utmost possible degree. No vision of one adept was accepted till it was checked and confirmed by the visions so obtained as to stand as independent evidence of other adepts and by centuries of experiences. So this is a scientific method. They each test all these traditions because they have perfected their physical, mental, psychic, and spiritual organizations. They have all these means of perception that science doesn't, and these means of perception are as objective as the physical ones are, which is not much to say because the physical senses we know are not very objective. Well, the inner senses are a little more objective. Still, they are not perfect until we come to that which is beyond all senses that I was talking about, the intuitive ability to become one. And then that is a far more perfect perception, which nevertheless, when we have to express it in language, falls into the limitations of language. So there is always a level of limitation when we try to express any truth, whether scientific or psychological or moral or spiritual. But the Blavatsky claims that the means of perception that these adepts have are far more reaching than the scientific ones and more accurate. Of course, scientists of the time didn't like this idea. You know, scientists were gods. What science says, it is. People are very excited when science seems to confirm something that the spiritual teachings have been saying for centuries. So people believe in meditation because science says that meditation is good. It's producing something good in the brain. Well, the effect in the brain is insignificant. It's almost meaningless compared to the effect that happens in the transformation in consciousness. So, sure, it is okay that science sees that something changes in the brain, but to me, I mean, I'm a scientist, or I was a scientist. I have a PhD in molecular biology, which means I went through the how scientists research, and I know the limitations of it. I'm not impressed by science. I mean, I'm impressed when science describes the physical plane. It's amazing what science can do. But I'm not impressed by science when it tries to go beyond the physical plane, because I always say theosophy ruined my scientific career. After I started studying theosophy, science became so small and something that was so exciting to me, but the perspective is far deeper, so science became so small. Again, I'm not trying to say science is useless, but there is a tendency, because we unconsciously believe that science is the stamp of truth, that if science says it is so, then it must be so. And if science doesn't say it is so, then we think, well, the spiritual teachings may or may not be. But science also keeps making mistakes and correcting the mistakes and correcting the correction of the mistakes. So if we associate the spiritual teachings with the scientific teachings too fast, and I'm going to do that, so I'm just warning you, then when science changes, what does it mean? That the spiritual teachings were wrong because you were saying, oh, this is true because science says it is true. Then science denies what it said before, so is this wrong? So it is a perilous road to try to use science to justify the spiritual teachings. I'm not quite doing that. I'm actually doing the opposite in a certain sense and saying what Blavatsky said at the time, which was crazy. The scientist said, who is this? She's a woman to begin with. So what can come? She is emotional. She's passionate. She's not cool-minded. You know, she's controversial. She doesn't care about all these rules of respectability. What can come from, who is she to tell us that what we are saying is wrong? And this is part of what Mitch was talking about in his lectures of why Blavatsky is dismissed. This is part of that. And the idea that, you know, nobody wants to have their well-established authority questioned. And unfortunately, Blavatsky questions scientists, religious people, spiritualists. Nobody's our friend because she just questioned everybody. And questioned theosophies too. If you see in her writings, she would be harsh with, you know, we are talking about all these ideals. How much of these ideals are really present in the Theosophical Society? She was questioning, you know, she had that function of questioning and was not partial to what she had created with her, you know, blood and sweat. So anyway, coming back to this, the idea is that there is this science that has a scientific method, and the teachings that we find in the secret doctrine are based on this science. So let us start at the beginning, or Blavatsky would say before the beginning, because this is before the beginning of the universe. She calls it the night of the universe. And she says that before there was a manifested cosmos, there is something that is eternal, the eternal parent, which she says is space. That eternal parent, if we are going to refer to it, we have to refer to it in the feminine way. So the eternal parent is she. She would say, Blavatsky would say, all deities in ancient traditions were always the first deity that appears, was always feminine. Like, for example, the highest deity is beyond any qualifications. So the absolute reality is it. But the first thing that we can talk about, that we can say something about, is feminine, is the womb of the universe, is the potentiality of the universe, is that from which things spring, is the eternal virgin that out of herself produces the whole universe, the idea of Blavatsky would normally refer this to as the Immaculate Conception, which is not quite how the Catholic doctrine talks about this, but the idea is that the Immaculate Conception, what she meant is that within this feminine principle, with nothing from outside, from within this feminine principle, the universe springs. So we are coming from a unity, not from a duality of the male and the female. So she would say the gods, the manifested gods, were always hermaphrodite, androgynes. They had male and female, and you can see early statues in Greece or in India where the gods have the two genders. Of course, when talking about gender, this is in a metaphorical way. At this point, it's not that space has any gender in particular. In any case, Blavatsky says that even when there is nothing in the universe, there was something, that is space. This is the first difference with the current view of the Big Bang. The idea in science is that space is created with the Big Bang. And this produces a lot of problems that then scientists have to do some mathematical, contortions to try to explain, and we will see that. But she says there is space from the very beginning. Now, what do we mean by space? We will see that too. And that space is wrapped in her ever-invisible robes. So there is something there, these robes, she will explain, is the essence of what will become matter. So there is a space, and it's not empty space. This space is substantial. And this is something that current science is discovering. We will see that. And that space had slumbered once again for 7 eternities. So once again, there is the idea of a cyclical movement there. And at this point, the space was slumbering, was asleep. So let's see what she says about this. About the eternal parents, the space. Space is the one eternal thing that we can most easily imagine, immovable in its abstraction, and uninfluenced by either the presence or absence in it of an objective universe. It is without dimension in every sense and self-existent, neither limitless void nor conditioned fullness, but both. It was and ever will be. This is very deep stuff that science is beginning to discover. First, the idea that space is immovable in its abstraction. Now, according to Einstein, space can be bent, can be stretched, can be contracted. Blavatsky says that that is not the case. That space, in its abstraction, is immovable, immutable, she says in other parts of the secret doctrine. Now, the way Blavatsky, I think, would explain what Einstein discovered, what Einstein is talking about, this bending of space and all of this, is what Blavatsky called the ether, because Blavatsky talks about space as this fabric, kind of fabric of space-time, and Blavatsky talked about space as having a substantial aspect that on the physical plane is what we call ether, and that ether we can have waves of ether, like the gravitational waves, which we will see a little later, the idea of ether, how I think science has discovered ether without calling it ether. But the idea is that space itself is this absolute abstract principle within which things appear, and are those things that can be bent or can be rearranged, that appear and disappear. We talk about the 3 dimensions of space, or 4 dimensions in science if we take time into account. But let's say the 3 dimensions of plane, Blavatsky says, of space, Blavatsky says, they are not dimensions of space. They are dimensions of the physical matter. When we say, height, length, etc., we are not describing space. We are describing the qualities of the matter that we can perceive. Space can accommodate infinite number of dimensions. This was crazy when Blavatsky said it. Today with quantum physics, they talk about like 11 possible dimensions of space. So you see, space is this abstract principle, container, immutable, which science, Newton, with all the criticisms that many times Newton gets after Einstein's theory of relativity, Newton's idea of this absolute space is far closer to Blavatsky's than Einstein's. And I think many of the problems that we see in science, both from the general relativity point of view and in quantum physics, is because we don't understand that space is filled with this ether. And saying filled with ether is not quite correct. Space on the physical plane is this ether. So when you see the famous two-slit, experiment in quantum physics, that you see like a wave or you can see the particle, to me that can be explained, at least philosophically. I don't know enough in science to put it, in quantum physics to put it in mathematical terms, but David Bohm did. To me, this is just the manifestation of the waves of ether going through the slits, and the waves of ether are also, the way David Bohm would put it, the particles are riding on a wave, and we see these 2 different results because you are measuring either the particle or the wave of ether that is moving along with the particles. So you don't need to postulate this crazy idea that the particle is at the same time a particle and a wave, which, is a cool idea, but it produces a lot of problems. Quantum physics, I think it's okay for quantum physics to question our daily perception of the world. And Blavatsky said, when you get to the level of the real atoms, the ultimate particles on the physical plane, they have different laws. They don't follow the same laws than the macroscopic universe has. She said that in one of her articles. Now, quantum physics to me is far more rational than it seems. The problem is that they are missing this idea of ether. And this is basically what David Bohm is postulating, if I, understand it correctly. In any case, the idea of this space is that it is this absolute principle within which everything happens. It is without dimension. It can accommodate any number of dimensions, as I was saying. You cannot say that it's a void, and we will see that quantum physics has come to this idea that the void doesn't exist. But it's not just a limitless void, and it's not a conditioned fullness. It's not something that is full of particular stuff. It is a principle that can be described in both ways. We will see a little more. I think quantum physics helps us to understand this on the physical level at least. So the robes, the invisible robes, Blavatsky explains, stand for the noumenon, or the cause, of undifferentiated cosmic matter, of the primordial matter that we see in the cosmos. It is not matter as we know it, but the spiritual essence of matter, and is co-eternal and even one with space in its abstract sense. So the idea that there is a spiritual essence to matter, that was also nonsense in the 19th century science. Matter was a collection of these little atoms that were like billiard balls. They were solid little packages of matter, indivisible. That's why they were called atoms. A means without, and toms comes from tomos, like volumes, divisions. So the atom was supposed to be non-divisible. So that was matter, and that was the building block of the universe. Well, Blavatsky says here, there is something that is the essence of that matter. And today, even on the physical plane, remember that when Blavatsky is talking about this, she's talking about inner planes, far before the physical plane manifests. But Blavatsky proposes a system where there is a correlation, where there is a reflection on all the planes of all these principles, on all the planes. So today, quantum physics has this idea of this quantum fluctuation that is not quite matter, but is not nothingness, that is the source of what we call matter, of all the subatomic particles. And that, to me, is a very accurate reflection on the physical plane of what Blavatsky is talking about here. This far before, actually, I have another talk where I think Blavatsky very clearly today, not at the time, from the point of view of the time, but very clearly sets the foundations of quantum physics. Everything that quantum physics discovered later on was foretold by Blavatsky with this idea of forces being material, and matter being a form of energy, etc., but we don't have time to go into it. So the last part of that first shloka in the Secret Doctrine is that the eternal mother, or the eternal parent, had slumbered once again, and Blavatsky explains the universe as a whole, as a boundless plane, is eternal. But periodically, it is the playground of numberless universes incessantly manifesting and disappearing. So you have this absolute container within which universes appear and disappear. And because this is the ultimate reality, it's the reality within us. And we can position ourselves in a state of consciousness in which, just as it happens in the cosmos, there is an immutable state within which thoughts and emotions appear and disappear. We did that this morning in the meditation. So when we are looking at what Blavatsky describes at the level of the cosmos, she's also describing our true nature. Everything that you see at the level of the universe, you can see it also in your own nature. So there is this absolute container spaciousness within which universes appear and disappear, and that is also at our own level. And this assertion of the Secret Doctrine is the absolute universality of that law of periodicity which physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature, such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and walking. So this talks about the idea of periodicity, cycles. And here is something also to me that is quite radical in what Blavatsky is saying here. Of course, Hinduism and other ancient traditions also postulated a cyclical universe. But in the Western world, people were not aware of this. Blavatsky is, the Secret Doctrine is among the first systematic presentations of the idea that the universe is cyclical. The universe, according to the Secret Doctrine, did not come from the Big Bang and is going to go on forever until it dissolves itself. But there is a cyclical process. And this is something that science is having to accept in spite of itself. So this person, Paul Steinhardt, he's one of the proposers of the fix that the Big Bang theory needs to explain what is actually out there in the universe. So you have what is actually out there. You have a theory that doesn't fit with what is actually there. So you bring a patch to explain in a kind of semi-miraculous way how this can explain that. And that miraculous way is what is called inflation. And this scientist is one of the proposers, the developers of inflation. But because he developed it, probably he understands that this is just an idea. It's not something that was proven. When we hear about all this, and scientists very confidently talk about the Big Bang and inflation, we assume these are facts. But he's aware that this is just an idea. And it's not quite the best idea. So he's reversing, and he's trying to find other ways that are less convoluted, more plausible, to explain the universe we actually see. So he's starting to propose a cyclical model of the universe that solves the problems with the Big Bang. There are several problems with the Big Bang. The idea that if everything came from, well, there are even fundamentally philosophical problems that we will see later, but even on the physical plane, if everything came from one point, then you will have an even distribution of matter in the universe, and you wouldn't have any galaxies or planets because you need the matter to clump, to come together. If everything comes from one point with an evenly distributed force, you will have just homogeneous atoms spread in the universe, and that doesn't happen. Then there is a problem of isotropy, that the idea that throughout the universe there is more or less the same temperature. You can see this in the background microwave radiation. Now, if things come from a center, then as things go out, they should cool off, and then things closer to the center should be, hotter. Of course, the idea of talking of a center of the universe is also complex because the space is expanding. We can't go in all these details, but I'm trying to explain it in a simple way. According to the Big Bang theory, there should be different temperatures in different parts of the universe, and there is not. There is the flatness problem. Again, they see that for the universe to be flat, remember that Einstein explained that physical space can be bent, and as I said, to me, it's not space, but the ether that is like the bones of the physical space, in a sense. So the idea is that the universe, they see that is flat. For the universe to be flat, the density of matter and energy has to be very precisely one little, exact number. The chances is like, going into a city, opening a random closet, picking a random piece of garment, and being exactly the size, the color that you need, So for the universe to be flat, it looks like that. How can you explain that the universe is not bent to more or less degree in one way or the other? So that is a problem if you are postulating that everything came from a point. So what this person saw is that you can do a mathematical trick if you postulate that somehow the universe expanded almost instantaneously to the size, more or less the size that we have today. That would make the universe flat. That would make the temperature of the universe uniform, and that would solve some of the problems. That would also clump matter to produce some galaxies. But then why did this happen? In science, if there is some movement, there has to be a force that enters into operation, produces this, and then it goes out of operation. Otherwise, the universe should keep expanding at the inflation rate. So this is why scientists say, give me one miracle and I can explain all the rest. So that one miracle is this that happened. So he's saying the standard model assumes that time has a beginning that we normally refer to as a Big Bang. According to this model, for reasons we don't quite understand, the universe sprang from nothingness, the idea of the singularity, this point, into somethingness full of matter and energy. But then he says, in the alternative cyclic model, the universe is endless. Time is endless in the sense that it goes on forever in the past and forever in the future. And in some sense, space is also endless. Now, there are different cyclic models of the universe which they don't need to, they don't have the problems that I was explaining. So we are going to see one a little later. But these scientists are, if you go to the internet, you can see like a list of different cyclic models that are being proposed. The problem is that it's very difficult to prove it scientifically, because this implies, how do you prove that something existed before your universe? You know, you can measure anything that is within your universe. How can you explain something that where you were not? So most scientists stick to the Big Bang theory because the other it cannot be proven. Perhaps at some point there is more and more evidence that this theory is inadequate, and then they may change in some way. We'll see what happens. So this is like the beginning of the universe, the idea of an immutable space within which that space is substantial, and we will see, as I said, how that is discovered later on. And it is within that space there is a cyclic movement. Now, so far we can say, okay, this is a modified scientific idea that science may come to at some point. Now, the secret doctrine introduces something that is unique to the spiritual view, that is the idea of a universal mind. There is not only time, not only space, not only matter, there is also mind. So, in the secret doctrine we read, the universal mind, when the universe was resting, was not. It was not manifested because there were no celestial beings, she uses this Sanskrit word ahi, to contain and hence manifest it. The idea of mind, of intelligence, in the secret doctrine is very interesting, quite abstract, impersonal, but if we understand it, it's very inspiring. Blavatsky doesn't postulate a God, an entity that is intelligent, fashioning the universe. She says, intelligence is in the very fabric of the universe. Just as the space is substantial, also that substance is intelligent. There is an intelligence there. Now, when there are no beings, and by beings let us take it in a very wide sense, celestial beings, human beings, plants, atoms, any manifestation of form is a being. When there are no beings, that intelligence is latent. As soon as forms begin, whenever there is a form that begins to organize itself, inevitably it expresses a form of intelligence. So when science says that consciousness is the epiphenomenon of matter, Blavatsky would agree with that, except that science is biased to saying, therefore, matter is real and intelligence or consciousness is just a secondary effect. Blavatsky would say, whenever you bring matter together, there will be a form of intelligence. But also, that matter exists because there is a form of intelligence. Form and consciousness, matter and spirit, cannot be separated. They are two sides of the same thing. And she would talk also about energy. So she would say, we see matter, that matter is a form of energy. We see energy, that energy is a form of consciousness. The matter aspect is more objective, evident. The consciousness aspect is more subjective, less evident. And it is interesting that science is moving in that direction. Science first thought that energy was something completely different from matter. Blavatsky said that that was not the case, that forces are substantial, which is the foundation of quantum physics, as I said. So science, by going deeper into matter, realized that energy and matter are the two manifestations of the same principle. So today, in quantum physics, when we talk about particles, we are not talking about a little bit of matter. We are talking about a form of motion, a form of energy is a physical particle. So, sure, on a certain level, you see it as matter. On another level, you see it as movement. Now, Blavatsky explains that that movement is consciousness. And I think that as we go deeper and deeper into understanding energy, science will start seeing that that movement is actually consciousness, which they are little by little in quantum physics, realizing that in some way, there is some kind of consciousness at that level. And the idea of panpsychism, pan means everywhere in nature, and psychism in the sense of intelligence. There are some in science that are proposing, well, maybe consciousness, because we cannot explain consciousness from the scientific point of view. They are saying maybe consciousness is as much a part of the universe as energy and matter are. This is exactly what Blavatsky is proposing. So Blavatsky says there is this principle of intelligence in the universe that we call the logos. Logos is a Greek word that means reason, word, order or structure. You know, one basic problem that is not often addressed in science with the idea of the Big Bang is the problem of entropy. The idea of entropy is that if you leave matter alone, there is a force within matter that pushes towards dispersion, destruction, dissolution. You know, you leave something and that something will crumble down. You need an intelligence to create forms. Intelligence, the only thing that opposes entropy is this force of destruction. The only thing that opposes entropy is some kind of intelligence. The plant is taking this matter that is formless and is bringing it and generating a cell. So the plant, the animal, everything. So the idea is that if everything came from a point where there were no forms, according to the law of entropy, when it expands, why would it create forms? If you leave matter alone, it will tend in the opposite direction. So Blavatsky says, along with that principle of dispersion, there is a principle of intelligence, the logos. This is the creator, not the creator as an entity outside. There is a creative aspect intrinsic in the universe that science, again, cannot perceive because this is something that is not within matter. Within matter, you see the entropy. Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, he would call matter evil, but not the matter as the atoms. What he called evil, as opposed to the good, he would call the divine intelligence as the good. Evil was this philosophically opposed force that tended to break down things. That is what we call entropy today. So, and then the logos that Plotinus used is this universal mind that brings things together and produces forms. So I think this is the reason why Blavatsky chose to call this universal mind logos. She uses also the Sanskrit term mahat, which is in Hinduism the same for the universal mind. But I think she was referring perhaps to the idea of the Neoplatonists, that there are these two forces. She talks about the forces, she calls them centrifugal, the forces for dispersion, and centripetal, the forces to bringing things together. So these two forces are in the fabric of the universe. So whenever there is a form, that form immediately manifests some kind of intelligence. How much intelligence? Well, as much as the complexity of the forms allows. So an atom is very simple, but it has its own intelligence. The atoms will be able to combine with some atoms and not with others. They will be able to create certain structures and not others. They have certain reactions and not others. There is an intelligence there. Very simple. We call it chemistry, but that is a form of intelligence. As the forms become more complex, bacteria have an amazing intelligence to be just one single, relatively simple cell. Parasites can take over your own brain or the brain of other animals and make you want and do things that they want to do. And this is a scientific, fact. So as the structures become more and more complex, this universal mind can express in wider and more complex ways. What we call human intelligence is simply the amount of logos, the amount of intelligence that can be expressed through a physical body. When the universe begins, the first thing that appears are these spiritual beings that are called the Ahi, the celestial beings, and that they are the structure that is the closest to the absolute mind, to this universal mind, and therefore they become the expression, the manifested expression of the universal wisdom, and they are the creators of the universe. Blavatsky would say the logos is not a being separated, it's the collectivity of intelligence everywhere. We are part of the logos. We are the logos expressing itself in human forms. Now, what is transcendental about this is that because we are the logos, we can raise our consciousness to the level of the universal mind. This is not a God out there that I have some kind of relationship, but that I'm always different from. So I can only be as close as God and not more. If you are sensitive, when you see nature, for example, the beauty of nature, there is a pain in the separation from that beauty. There is a yearning to become one with that beauty. A beauty that is, poets would talk about the painful beauty, because you have this sense of longing to be one with that. And that is possible. And that is the same with God. If God was an entity separate from us, we could never become one with God. This idea is that we can realize the divine, we can become, we can experience, we can be the divine when we raise our consciousness to that level. So, although this is an impersonal divinity, impersonal means that it is available to everybody, to every person. It's not an isolated individual. People think that something that is impersonal is bland or is dry, something impersonal is with no features. On the contrary, impersonal means everywhere available. You can touch God anywhere at any time. And this is the divinity that Blavatsky is proposing. Now, of course, we have to learn how to perceive that essence that is behind things. And the purpose of the Theosophical teachings is not only to tell you this, but to show you how to do this. Sometimes we are fascinated with the ideas, and we lose sight of all the vast amount of teachings that Blavatsky and other Theosophical teachers give us to actually perceive this, to whatever level that we can attain at the time. In one of my books, in the second part, I expressly use Blavatsky's teachings to show ways, practical ways that she recommended, so that we can perceive this, not just as a philosophy, but as an inner experience. So again, as we describe all this on the cosmic level, always keep in mind that this is a description of our own essence, because this brings an inspiration. This brings a purpose. This brings a sense that, yes, of course we want to be comfortable. It's nice when things are pleasant, but this is something far more important than that. So we start looking at the personal life in its right proportion or perspective. We are not denying it, but beginning to perceive something that is far more transcendental, then we are not caught in the shallowness of the personal or the egocentric approach to life, which is a disease in our culture. So she explains that this universal or absolute mind always is, it is immutable, but during the night of the universe there is nothing to receive and reflect the ideation of the universal mind. There is no form to express it. Therefore, the universal mind is not when there is nothing to express it. It's just a potentiality. The absolute is dormant, latent mind. Then the stanzas or the shloka, the word shloka is the Sanskrit for verse. I'm talking about some stanzas that are presented in the Secret Doctrine. So the shloka says, the next one, the universe was still, no, this is in the second stanza. The universe was still concealed in the divine thought and the divine bosom. These two are the germ, and the germ is one. So she starts talking about the two principles that will give rise to the universe. The divine thought, that is this principle of intelligence. The divine bosom, that is this space, within this substantial space, within which, when something happens, and we will see what that something is, and structures begin to be formed within the divine bosom, then the divine thought begins to be expressed. And these first structures are the primordial 7 divine beings that Blavatsky talks about. So she says, at the beginning of cosmic evolution, the universe, or the sun, lies concealed in the divine thought, and the divine thought does not imply the idea of a divine thinker. As I explained, the idea of the logos is not an entity. The divine thought is this intrinsic intelligence that is in the universe. She takes pain to talk about this. Now, later on she says, there is always a synthetic consciousness, like the white light that is the source of the 7 colors. So there is an aspect of the logos that is more like a synthetic, a kind of unifying consciousness. And that I think Blavatsky had more a Buddhist view. The Hindu view is more prone to talk about the manifestation of consciousness as coming from a being. The Buddhist view traditionally denies the idea of beings because these are impermanent. You could see the logos more from the point of view of this unifying consciousness. But because that is so close to the idea of God, a God as a separate thing, Blavatsky tried to emphasize the other aspect. And I think it's very important that we fully understand this other aspect. Then you could say, when you can conceive of this in an abstract sense, you can say the whole solar system is a bubble of consciousness, let's say, within which everything appears. That bubble of consciousness is the logos. The sun may be the heart, allegorically speaking, of that logos. But everything in the universe is or in the cosmos, in the solar system in this case, is the logos. I would recommend to work for long enough with this idea of the impersonal logos until we can discover the beauty of it, the inspiration behind it. And then we can consider the logos also perhaps as a single, consciousness. And then she says, the germ is the point representing matter in its abstract sense. So she says that these two, the space and the thought, are the primordial matter too. And this is one. All this at the beginning, before the manifestation of the universe, these are all different aspects of a single principle. They are not separate. And she says it is the point representing matter in its abstract sense, but the term point must not be understood as applying to any particular point in space, for a germ exists in the center of every metaphysical atom. When she talks about atom, she doesn't talk about the physical atom. She used to say the scientific atom is really a molecule. By that she meant that it's composed of parts, it's separate, you can separate it. By atom she meant the homogeneous origin of matter. And these collectively the essence of matter throughout the universe collectively form the germ, if the term can be applied to something which is boundless and infinite. So what Blavatsky is saying here is that, and we are going to see that, the universe doesn't come from a single point. She says the germ is in the whole boundless infinite space. Because remember, we are talking about an immutable space, one aspect of which is substance, another aspect of which is intelligence, and this is the background for the universe. So this denies the idea in the Big Bang that time and space were created from a singular point, which, as I said, the idea of singularity is a big problem in science. So there are some scientists that, as I mentioned, are trying to work out a different theory. So let us continue now with this theory of this cyclic theory, because I think this one in particular, the M theory, is very close to what Blavatsky is proposing. So again, Paul Steinhardt said this theory is a radical alternative to the standard Big Bang inflationary scenario, which he helped to create, that offers a new approach to resolving the homogeneity, isotropy, and flatness problems. According to the M theory, the observable universe lies on a brain, or membrane, short for membrane, separated by a small gap along an extra dimension from a second brain or membrane. I'll show an image of this. And the Big Bang is a collision between the brains that occurs at regular intervals, so this is in a cyclical way, each bang creating hot matter and radiation, and triggers an epoch of expansion, cooling, and structure formation. There is an interbrain. This is we are going to see but it's like two brains that touch each other. When they touch, the Big Bang starts, and there is an interbrain force responsible for drawing the brains together cyclically, whose potential energy acts like dark energy when the brains are far apart. I'll explain all this. Each cycle ends with a contraction of the extra dimension and a collision between the brains, a new Big Bang. So basically what he says is that when the universe is in repose, there are two brains here. You see there are two that are touching. Each of these brains are three-dimensional, so it's not just like a sheet of paper, but for the purposes of the illustration, you have like the three-dimensional universe, and there is another one, and these are the two brains. When there is nothing there, let's say they are coming to collide. We will see why they are about to collide as we go around the cycle. When they touch, then that produces a certain energy that touches the whole universe. You see, here it's not coming from any particular point. The whole universe touches the other, let's say, universe, and simultaneously, throughout the whole universe, you start having matter that little by little, these bubbles there are the result, he explains, of quantum fluctuations that begin to generate subatomic particles, and eventually it starts generating galaxies. And because things are not coming from a point, you can explain these bubbles are the skeleton on which matter coagulates so that they are not evenly distributed. And then as matter begins to generate, there is an expansive force within space that makes them grow apart and eventually dissolve. As forms dissolve, the quantum fluctuation begins to be flat, like constant, and it loses the ability to generate matter. And then the force that is in between the two brains start drawing the brains together, and that starts activating the quantum fluctuation again until they touch again. All this is backed up by mathematics. He can explain what we see in the universe by mathematics, and I think this is close to what Blavatsky said for many reasons. The universe doesn't come from a point. space is pre-existing. There is a cyclic nature to this. The manifestation of the universe starts not preordained by a God, but just because of the very nature of the universe. This is something that Blavatsky says. It's not that some people ask, why did God decide to manifest the universe? There is no decision here. This is just the nature of the absolute reality. We are close to the end. So, yeah, I'm sorry. To the end of the talk, not to the end of the... So the next, so when Blavatsky explains the awakening of the universe, she says that the last vibration, that, in the previous model, we see this quantum fluctuation that is there always. Blavatsky calls this the vibration, that is there always, whether there is a universe or not. But there is a change in the vibration, like there is a change in the quantum fluctuation. So when that change happens, the vibration thrills through infinitude. Here is what I said, that it was not foreordained by a God. And the vibration sweeps along, touching with its swift wing simultaneously the whole universe. You see, like this happens in the whole brain. And the germ that dwells in darkness is also touched by this. And then Blavatsky says here that basically that the space is not a vacuum, that the chaos, she says, are the vacuum to our mental side, in which lie the latent spirit and matter, but vacuum in the sense of space, not in the sense of empty space. She says, she quotes this, nature abhors a vacuum. And this is what quantum physics has discovered. As it turns out, the vacuum is not empty. There is a difference between the vacuum and nothingness. From a particle physics point of view, the vacuum is permeated by a Higgs field. This is a theoretical physicist from CERN, Álvaro de Rújula. So these Higgs fields, again, is this akasha that Blavatsky talks about, that is the space in itself, and that akasha is energy, and that akasha is intelligence. So from the very origin of the universe, we have intelligence, we have matter, we have energy, and everything that happens in the universe has a purpose. I cannot go into that simply because we don't have enough time, but Blavatsky builds on this to show that whatever we see in the universe has intelligence behind. Whatever happens in your life is for a purpose. The evolution, the organisms appearing and disappearing is the expression of intelligence. And if we meditate on this, we begin to feel that we are part of a cosmic movement, intelligent movement, with a very clear as we can perceive it, purpose, and there is a reason why we are here. So basically, what I wanted to share is this idea that if we can grasp this fundamental idea of the nature of the universe, where we come from, where everything comes from, which science little by little is beginning is forced to agree on, although they haven't gotten quite so far as recognizing consciousness. But if we grasp this, then a whole different worldview opens up for us. And this is the purpose of the Theosophical teachings, to offer a different worldview where life has a meaning, a purpose, far more transcendental than just being happy or being in a pleasurable condition. And this is the challenge that Blavatsky proposed and proposes to us today.
One thing I remember from The Secret Doctrine, I think it is, or from her work, is that she talks about the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. And when the two start knocking together, which is what you were saying on a macro level, with the brains, the two, when in our brain, the two pituitary and the pineal glands start knocking together, then we start connecting to the higher levels, building our antakarana. And I thought, wow, this is just what you're talking about, but on a micro level.
Yeah, she talks about the aura of the pituitary gland awakening the aura of the pineal gland, and then that becomes at the level of the brain a bridge to the higher consciousness, which, yes, you can relate to these ideas.
Thank you, Pablo, for really tremendous and inspiring presentation. I do have one question, though. It arises from what you've said, and I don't know whether the way I'll ask it relates in a way that you can answer it. But it does sound that the teachings do describe the parent or the space as it says immutable, which I would take to mean unconditioned. And then the conditioned arises from that.
Exactly.
And this is something I'm personally interested in, is that the idea that, is that correct according to the Theosophical teachings?
And she goes more into detail in other parts. I was quoting the stanza in the poem. She explains all that to great depth, that is boundless, immutable, unconditioned, timeless, etc.
And from your studies of other traditions, whether it be Hindu and Buddhism, I know you're familiar with both of them, does that match or and I'm not sure about it, I gather that usually the conditioned arises from conditioned. So would you see some discrepancy between, say, these other traditions?
Yes, Blavatsky says that there is something that we cannot quite grasp, which is how within the mutable appears. So she says it's basically this element that she calls fohat, because of the nature of the universe. At some point, a movement appears. This is similar, I think, to what they say in Hinduism. They talk about the pradhana, like this substance in which all the gunas are in equilibrium. And then something happens that breaks the equilibrium, and then there is an interplay within the gunas that produce forms. So in that sense, that would be similar to what Blavatsky is saying. There is something that happens that generates a conditioning within that which is beyond conditioning. Now, Blavatsky calls that the self-existing. It's causeless. It's not produced by a previous cause. When she she says it's very difficult to explain it because our mind cannot really grasp it. But she tried to use devices to make the differences, at least conceptually. She would say, from this absolute immutable reality, a first cause appears, which is the unmanifested logos. This is conditioned. This is a different kind of logos or intelligence in each universe. And she says, this is a radiation, not an emanation. What she meant is that this is a spontaneous happening. It's not something produced by something else. So it's just like when we are watching our minds, thoughts appear spontaneously there. That's how I would connect it. So within that movement, all thoughts are conditioned. We can feel, if we stay there, we can feel that there is a space that is not really affected, within which everything comes and goes. So there is a mystery in the passage from the unconditioned to the conditioned that Blavatsky recognizes and says, by a process that is incomprehensible to us, this happens. I think in Buddhism, because of the difficulty of explaining this, normally it's the idea, okay, everything is conditioned. Or at least in some schools of Buddhism. I don't know if there is, if Nagarjuna, explained, I'm familiar with Nagarjuna, but not to this extent, if it can explain whether there is something that is unconditioned, how things may arise there. In the Tathagata Garbha teachings, they try to explain this, but I'm not so familiar to be able to relate it exactly to the secret doctrine. But it is a mystery.
But I seem, in general, you postulate a universe out there separate from me. Or perhaps objects separate from my perception of them. Can you take that idea?
Well, I tried not to do that. Evidently, I failed. But no, I absolutely agree. That's why I kept saying, when we are talking about the universe, we are talking about our own nature. We are the logos. Everything that is happening in the universe is happening within us. And in the meditation this morning, we tried to do a little, to have a sense of that. So the objects are separate from me when I identify with a fragment. There is this fragment that is separate from those fragments. On this level, sure, objects are different from me. But if I dig deep enough, I realize I'm not this fragment. Every fragment is the expression of I can be in a state of consciousness or conscious non-consciousness, as Blavatsky would call it, in which there is no identification with the fragment, and there is this sense that everything is within me. So eventually that has different levels of manifestation, but eventually that means we are the logos. So then when we focus ourselves at the level of objects, yes, we are separate objects. Let's see the last one, yeah.
A quick comment and then a question. There's been a recent model of science that's sort of become developed in the last few years called the electric universe model. And it really does overlap, although it is far from perfect, it does overlap with a lot of what the secret doctrine says, has like Akasha, the ether, as like the basic medium through which light and electricity and magnetism flows through. It's amazing, amazing. I highly encourage everyone to research it. But sort of on a philosophical question, there are answers to the idea of, as a counter to the idea of like eternal duration, that the universe doesn't have a beginning, that if the universe is eternal, then we would have never arisen at the present, because time would keep just going back and back and back and back without, although albeit true cop-out that all time exists within the same moment. How would you say philosophically that we have reached a distinct present moment within eternal duration?
Mm-hmm. So first, the electric universe is very close to the secret doctrine. In the second, this is a series of talks that I have. The second talk is all about Fohat and electricity and how the theories of the electric universe match quite well with the secret doctrine. Now, the idea of time, Blavatsky says, timeless or duration, as she called it. She said, we have a word that I cannot translate. When she was taught by her adept teachers, they have terms that are not common. And she says, I'm trying to translate it as duration. I think today she would use timelessness. And she would say, duration is not infinite time. Time is finite. Time starts and finishes. When these brains, if we say in the scientific model, touch, time appears. And then when the universe dissolves, time disappears. All that happens within duration. Because she says time is not a real thing, it depends on consciousness. Time is just a succession of the states of consciousness. So time exists only as long as there are conscious beings. And different conscious beings have different perceptions of time. So the idea that we are right here and now is an illusion produced by our consciousness. There is present, there is past, there is future, and there is the eternal now, which mystics perceive when they go beyond consciousness, when they go to what is prior to consciousness, to this conscious non-consciousness that we cannot grasp. So time is an illusion, and that's why we feel we are now and not before or after.
Pablo, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.